Good morning, Brea Congregational Church. Unfortunately, this morning our live stream tech, Mark Tabula, is away unexpectedly. So we won't have the full live stream of the service. Our apologies. But I'm hopeful that this sermon can offer you some spiritual sustenance until we gather again together next week. When I ask you to think of the wisest person you've ever known, who do you think of? Do you think of a parent who guided you through your growing years? Do you think of a teacher or a pastor who helped situate intellect and compassion within the world around you? Do you think of a friend or a sibling who showed you how to be a loving presence with few words but kind action? I imagine we can all think of someone who has brought forth wisdom, even perhaps beyond their years on this planet. For Ellie Lee, award-winning director, writer, and producer, and first-generation immigrant from China, her father is the person who has offered her that wisdom throughout her entire life. Ellie notes that sometimes the wisdom is unconventional. Throughout her childhood, she would often question his wisdom. She remembers times like when they immigrated to the United States, and her father wanted each of them to choose an American name to make the transition smoother. Ellie remembers rolling her eyes at her dad when he chose the American name Ming. No, Ming wasn't his Chinese name, just a name he thought Americans would be able to pronounce. It was times like these when Ellie would reflect that her father was on to something, but the execution would sometimes fall a little short. Like the time he found a sale at the local shop. They were selling monogrammed belt buckles. Her father came home with one that had a big shiny A on the front. No, his American name did not begin with an A. His Chinese name did not begin with an A. Their family name was Lee, no A in sight. His wife and children, none of their names began with an A. So when Ellie asked why it was that he chose that belt buckle instead of maybe an L for Lee, he responded, "Well, I bought A for Ace." Ellie knew her dad would often strive to be number one, and his new belt buckle said so. The wisdom he was instilling in his children that they could do anything or be anything, even as poor immigrants, was, well, subtle, but would begin to guide Ellie as she entered into adulthood. During the first few years that Ellie and her family were in the United States, Ellie remembers that her dad would rarely have time off. He worked tirelessly to provide for their family in their new country. After some time, he was able to save enough money to begin his own business, a small, modest grocery store in Boston's Chinatown. And, you guessed it, he called it Ming's Market. In Chinese, the store was called Penga Shishang, which means cheap-priced market. Ellie remembers her dad marking items up by 5 cents or 10 cents. She wondered how he was ever going to make a profit when there was such a slim margin. But sure enough, little by little, he began to create a loyal following. Working families and Chinese immigrants, for perhaps the first time, had a place where they could find affordable, healthy, good groceries. After about 10 years of running his store, it had become a very successful business from a financial standpoint. It had become the largest Asian market in New England, but perhaps even more importantly, it had become successful in anchoring the community. Ellie realized the success of her father's business, but still questioned the depth and validity of just another one of her father's crazy ideas. One day, the store caught fire. They were able to evacuate the building. All of the employees safely escaped the market. But when the firefighters arrived and began hooking up the hoses to the fire hydrants, they realized that there was no water. They went down a couple of blocks, hooked up the hoses there, still no water. What had happened was the city of Boston, a few months earlier, had been doing road construction in the neighborhood. In the process, they turned off the water to do repairs, but never remembered to turn it back on before they sealed up the road. So the building continued to burn. The fire eventually jumped over an alley, and it set another building on fire, which housed thousands of illegal fireworks. Ellie's dad sat and watched the massive explosions, the horrific flames ripping through all of his life's work. So much gone in just a moment. Finally, the firefighters were able to jerry-rig a set of hoses many blocks away, and eventually they got the fire out. As Ellie approached the store in the aftermath, she looked across to see 3 elderly women crying, looking at the rubble. She approached them, asked them if they were okay, and through their tears they said, "Where are we going to go now? We're no longer home. We no longer have a home." Ellie reflects that this was a turning point for her in the way that she viewed her father's business and her father in general. She had never thought of her dad's store as a home for so many people. This community, they didn't have a community center. They didn't have a public park. The only place that they had was the store, and now the store was gone. No more running into friends, no more seeing labels in a familiar language, no more space where someone would notice if you hadn't been around in a while. After some time, people began to ask her father when he would reopen the store. The fire had done $20 million worth of damage, and he wasn't sure when or if he would be able to reopen. But with the small amount of money he had left, pooled together with the other employees who had worked there for decades, they were able to reopen the store on the outskirts of Chinatown. They opened in the neighborhood that no one else wanted to be in. Not the nicest, not the safest, but they wanted to rebuild the community that they had lost. Of course, Ellie, once again, rolled her eyes at her dad's antics. But once again, her father was right. The new store revitalized the community. There were loyal families who came from the suburbs. There were more jobs, and soon more and more businesses came into the area. Young families were moving in. Life was thriving, and much of it centered around the store that had created the community to begin with. Eventually, the area became some of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the Boston area. Eventually, Ellie's dad got an eviction notice from the owner because he wanted to use the land instead to build luxury condos. Ellie asked her dad what he wanted to do. He was in his 70s now, and she knew that there were people in the community, employees, many of whom didn't speak English or have other job prospects, other folks who relied on this store being a hub of life in Chinatown. And so her dad finally decided that he was too old to fight. He told Ellie that he would go along with the eviction because he was too tired and didn't have the energy to be the one to take on the landlord. As Ellie reflected on all that the store had been and still was, the employees who desperately needed their jobs, the folks in the community who relied not only on the groceries, but also on the place of connection that the store offered, she realized that her dad may have been too old to fight, but she was not. She organized the community. She led a grassroots movement to fight City Hall and one of the largest land developers in New England. Eventually, they got the support from the mayor, and after their first public hearing, she went to check in on the folks at the store. 2 older female employees rushed up to her as she came in. They thanked her. They told her that they didn't often feel like they had a voice. They didn't often feel like they could advocate for themselves. But in this moment, they felt like they mattered, that the community mattered. As Ellie looked into their eyes, as she saw the humility and the compassion and the grace that these women possessed, it was in that very moment that she fully understood the wisdom her father had been offering all along. In our scripture lessons this morning, we see a common thread running through the readings of wisdom. We have heard Jesus telling people that he is the bread of life in many different iterations throughout the Gospels, but it is in this passage that we hear him say that the people who have gone before ate a different kind of bread, and now the people might be able to see a new way, a new bread that not only feeds the body, but fills the spirit and the soul too. Jesus is offering us this wisdom. He's offering it to all who will hear it. But the implication, at least to me, is that this bread of life is much harder to understand. It's not the bread of subsistence, the bread that will keep your organs functioning or the blood pumping through your veins. It is the bread that will ask you how you are going to be a follower of Christ. And isn't that how wisdom usually comes? It doesn't come to state the obvious. It doesn't come to tell you the basics. It comes in a deep and rooted way to connect us to the divine. In fact, there are traditions that see God as wisdom as God, and it is a theology that I invite you to sit with in the coming week. If God is wisdom, where is wisdom? Where is God leading you? Reverend Chrissy Cataldo, pastor at Winthrop UCC, reflects on wisdom, and Dr. Will Gaffney's work on biblical wisdom. Gaffney says that wisdom is not simply intellect. It is also skill, expertise, honed by experience and practice. A person who is wise does not come to wisdom immediately. Wisdom is cultivated in the same way that an apprentice learns from a master. Wisdom is your grandmother showing you how to add enough flour to the dough to keep it from sticking as you roll it out. Wisdom makes sure that you point your knife away from your thumb when you whittle, not towards it, so you don't slip and cut yourself. Dr. Gaffney calls this heart and head knowledge. Wisdom is teaching, practicing, listening, and knowing, all wrapped up together. And now, as your resident millennial, I have to say I love living in a time when I can Google something in a matter of seconds. I like knowing facts, and I like having access to what is happening in the world at any given moment. But I think these things are the subsistence type of bread that Jesus spoke about. Wisdom tells us not the quick answers. It tells us the information that is further than our fingertips. It's not only the bread we need. And so may we go forth hungering for a bread of deep wisdom. May we go forth searching for the deep and abiding love of the Creator that comes to us through that bread of life. Amen, and blessed be